There are stories that don't begin with a meeting, a smile, or an exchange of messages. They begin the exact moment someone realizes they shouldn't be feeling this way. It's not a shock, nor a fright. It's a silent discomfort, almost polite, like a thought that asks permission before entering. At first, the person tries to ignore it. They tell themselves it's just admiration, just care, just too much closeness. But the body begins to react before the mind can find arguments. The gaze lingers a second longer. The silence becomes too comfortable. And without realizing it, something crosses a line that was never drawn on the ground, but always existed. A forbidden love doesn't announce its arrival. It simply settles in, like a large piece of furniture placed in a small room, forcing everything around it to change places, even if no one notices from the outside. From that moment on, something even heavier than the feeling is born. The secret, not because someone decided to hide it, but because there's no space to say it. It's like carrying a closed box inside your chest, knowing exactly what's inside, but pretending every day that it doesn't exist. Life goes on outside, work, conversations, laughter. While inside, every gesture needs to be calculated. The secret starts small, almost harmless, but grows in the same proportion that it is fed by silence. And the more time passes, the more it shapes who you become. Not because the love is too great, but because hiding it requires a version of you that learns to survive in the absence of your own truth. Over time, what seemed like just a misplaced feeling begins to alter how the world is perceived. It's no longer about the person themselves, but about the space they occupy within your emotional routine. Everything starts to be measured from that perspective. A good day is one in which there was closeness, even if minimal. A bad day is one in which contact didn't happen. It's like living with a radio tuned to a frequency only you can hear. No one around notices the sound, but it never turns off. This invisible presence begins to influence small decisions, then medium ones, then large ones. You choose paths, schedules, answers, and even silences based on the need to maintain a balance between appearing normal and continuing to feel. And the most dangerous thing is that, at a certain point, this starts to seem sustainable. The person believes they can manage it, that all it takes is care, that all it takes are limits. But feelings don't respect internal agreements. They accumulate, adapt, and find loopholes. It is at this stage that forbidden love ceases to be merely an emotional risk and transforms into a parallel identity. There is who you are to the world and who you are when no one is watching. The most honest analogy is that of an actor who never breaks character, not even when the stage empties. The effort is not in loving, but in not showing it, in controlling the tone of voice, the response time, the intensity of the gaze. Each interaction becomes an emotional minefield. And yet, there are moments of silent pleasure, a mutual understanding that doesn't need to be spoken, an exchange of energy that only happens because it is forbidden. This creates the illusion of something rare, almost sacred. But the cost begins to appear in the details. Sleepless nights, recurring thoughts, the constant feeling of being indebted to someone, even without knowing exactly who. The secret, which before seemed like protection, begins to transform into a prison. There's a specific moment when nothing happens on the outside, but everything changes on the inside. There's no announcement, no choice, no prior warning. The feeling simply crosses the boundary of what was safe and begins to occupy a larger space than it should. At first, it has no name. It seems like just a slight discomfort, excessive attention, a recurring thought that arises unbidden. It's like entering a river thinking the water will be at the right temperature, only to realize a few seconds later that it's too cold. But you're already in. It wasn't a rational decision. No one plans the exact second when something starts to matter too much. The mind still tries to act as before, but the body already reacts differently. The heart races for no apparent reason. The presence of that person changes the environment. And even without understanding why, something has already crossed an invisible boundary. This is the first breaking point, when consciousness realizes too late that the territory has changed. The personal experience of those who live through this is almost always silent. There's no confession, no drama, just the unsettling feeling that returning to shore isn't so simple anymore. The routine continues. The conversations remain the same, but inside a constant vigilance arises, as if any word could betray something you can't even explain. The observer recognizes this moment because it's universal. No one chooses the exact moment when they begin to care excessively. Just like in the river, the shock isn't in the cold water but in the realization that you entered without noticing. And from then on, everything demands more care, more silence, and more control. Because crossing that first boundary changes how you feel, even if the world around you still seems exactly the same. There is a silent transformation that happens when a feeling encounters a barrier. Until then, it might be confused, diffuse, perhaps even controllable. But the instant the "you can't" arises, something changes speed. The prohibition doesn't create what was already being born. It merely removes the brakes. It's like a small fire that, under normal conditions, could extinguish itself, but which gains strength when the wind blows against it. The more resistance, the more intense the flame seems. The mind begins to interpret the limit as a challenge, and what was previously just an emotional inconvenience begins to occupy too much space. Not because it has become bigger, but because now there is something that needs to be hidden, contained, denied. Personal experience shows that the "you can't" doesn't come as a rational warning. It comes as a burden. It arises in the subtext, in the implicit rules in situations where the feeling needs to be swallowed before it comes out of the mouth. It is at this point that everything intensifies. Every fleeting encounter gains exaggerated importance. Every silence becomes charged. Thought returns to the same place repeatedly, as if trying to understand why something so strong needs to exist in secret. Like a fire fueled by the contrary wind, trying to extinguish it only spreads the flames. The emotion grows not by choice, but by compression. The observer recognizes this process because it is not romantic, it is human. Prohibition does not make the feeling arise, it only accelerates what was already in motion. When something is allowed, it resolves itself with time. When it is denied, it crystallizes. Experience reveals that the true fuel is not desire, but the imposed limit. The more rigid the rule, the more it activates the imagination. The greater the silence, the noisier the feeling becomes inside. And at this stage, the conflict is no longer between two people, but between what is felt and what one knows one shouldn't feel. There's a type of exhaustion that doesn't show on social media, leaves no visible marks, and can't be explained in a few words. It's the exhaustion of someone who lives two versions of themselves simultaneously. A public version, functional, controlled, that walks through doors smiling, answers the right messages, posts what needs to be posted, and keeps the image intact. And another silent version that only exists when no one is watching, carrying feelings that can't be shown, much less explained. It's like changing emotional clothes every time you change environments. When leaving home, you put on normality. When arriving at work, you put on neutrality. Among friends, the rehearsed lightness. And inside, something completely different continues to happen. It's not a conscious lie. It's survival. Each door demands an adaptation, and each adaptation consumes a little more energy. Over time, the observer perceives an uncomfortable truth. The exhaustion doesn't come from the feeling itself, but from the constant effort to hide it. Loving in silence isn't the heaviest hookup. It's the maintenance of the daily charade that drains. It's remembering what can be said, what should be avoided, how to look without seeming too much, how to distance oneself without causing strangeness. Social media shows an organized, balanced, even happy life, but it doesn't show the moment when that person arrives home and finally takes off that tight emotional clothing, feeling a relief mixed with emptiness. Living two lives isn't glamorous. It's exhausting. And the longer it lasts, the harder it becomes to distinguish where the version shown to the world ends and where the real person begins. Because the danger isn't just hiding feelings from others, it's little by little starting to hide them from oneself. There's a point where fear splits in two, and neither offers rest. On one side, the fear of being discovered, of having feelings exposed before being ready, of causing irreversible ruptures, of breaking silent agreements that keep everything seemingly stable. On the other hand, there is a deeper, less confessable fear, the fear of never truly being seen. It is in this conflict that the experience becomes suffocating, because hiding requires control, but not being seen requires resistance. The person lives calculating gestures, words, silences, while inside something demands recognition. It's like shouting underwater. There is strength, there is intention, there is urgency, but the sound doesn't get through. Those on the outside only see bubbles rising, without imagining the effort that exists down there. The viewer realizes that the true weight lies not in the possibility of loss, but in the permanence of invisibility. Losing is still an event, something that happens and, in some way, closes a cycle. Not being seen is continuing to exist without confirmation. It is loving without a mirror. It is offering presence without a clear return. The analogy of the submerged scream deepens because, the longer one spends underwater, the less strength remains to scream. The body adapts to the imposed silence and the mind begins to normalize the absence of response. This is the real danger. When the fear of being discovered prevents any movement, and the fear of not being seen transforms into a chronic pain, almost invisible even to the one who feels it. At this point, the conflict ceases to be external and becomes internal. It is no longer about protecting others from a truth, but about surviving at the cost of not fully existing in the eyes of those who matter most. Before the mind can organize any explanation, the body has already understood everything. He notices what is being ignored, even when his conscience insists on calling it an exaggeration, a phase, or a passing confusion. Insomnia begins without fanfare. Sleep comes but doesn't stay. The body lies down tired, but the mind doesn't switch off, as if something is always pending, unresolved. The chest tightens at random moments without a clear connection to what is happening around him. Breathing becomes short when that person appears, or when a message takes longer than expected. There is also constant distraction, the inability to be fully present anywhere, because part of his attention is always occupied sustaining the silence. The body reacts because it doesn't know how to pretend. He feels the weight before any rational argument. The narrative makes it clear that the body exacts a price for what is left unsaid. Contained emotions don't disappear. They shift. That which finds no outlet in words manifests itself in muscle tension, in unexplained fatigue, in irritation that arises out of nowhere. The viewer recognizes this pattern because it is common. When silence lingers, the body assumes the role of messenger. Each symptom is a physical reminder that something is being sustained beyond its limit. It's not weakness, it's accumulation. The body signals because keeping feelings hidden requires continuous effort, and continuous effort generates wear and tear. At this point, it is no longer possible to separate emotion from physiology. The body begins to speak louder precisely because the mind insists on remaining silent, and the longer this silence lasts, the more evident it becomes that ignoring what one feels does not eliminate the impact, it only changes where it will manifest itself. In the beginning, there is the illusion that time will organize everything on its own. Just wait a few days, a few weeks, maybe a few months, and what bothers you will lose its power, dissolve naturally. But time doesn't solve secrets, it learns to live with them. It becomes an accomplice. The days go by, the routine adjusts, and the problem doesn't disappear. It just becomes more sophisticated, more discreet, more integrated into life. Personal experience reveals this clearly. The feeling that once caused strangeness becomes manageable, fitted between commitments, disguised as habits. It doesn't hurt all the time, but it never goes away either. Time teaches you to function despite it, not without it. The viewer realizes that the danger lies precisely in this adaptation. When nothing explodes, when there is no confrontation or rupture, a sense of control is created. The person learns when to think, when to avoid, when to distract themselves. The secret ceases to be an event and becomes a system. Each day adds a new layer, better justifications, more elegant silences, more convincing internal lies. The problem deepens because it becomes normalized. Time, in this context, is not a cure. It is anesthesia. It reduces the shock but increases the duration. And the more time passes, the harder it becomes to identify where it all began and why it is still there. The secret grows along with life, occupying spaces that were once free, shaping future decisions without ever presenting itself as the protagonist. Thus, time does not liberate. It only teaches how to carry the weight with more skill, transforming something temporary into something permanent without anyone noticing exactly when it happened. At some point, the secret begins to leave its mark on the outside. These aren't confessions or explosions, but small cracks that appear on the surface. A gaze that lingers too long, a question asked casually but carrying intention, a subtle change in behavior that doesn't go unnoticed. No one points directly, no one accuses, but something in the air changes. It's like a cracked wall inside a house. Everyone sees the fissure, everyone realizes it wasn't there before, but no one comments. There's a silent agreement to feign normality, because acknowledging the crack would require dealing with what it represents. Experience shows that at this stage the discomfort doesn't just come from the hidden feeling, but from the awareness that it's no longer as invisible as before. The observer identifies this moment because it's marked by the tension of almost a direct question, almost a serious conversation, almost a revelation. People around begin to test limits, observe reactions, gather clues. And whoever keeps the secret feels the weight double, because now it's not enough to control what they feel. They need to manage the perception of others. Every gesture is mentally reviewed, every silence is evaluated. The wall remains standing, but the crack is there, slowly expanding. Pretending it doesn't exist requires collective effort, but the greatest strain falls on those closest to the structural flaw. Because deep down, everyone knows that cracked walls aren't resolved with indifference. They simply await the moment when the damage becomes too great to ignore, even if no one has confirmed anything until then. There is a guilt that has no name, no face, and doesn't know where to go. It doesn't arise from a mistake made, but from something felt in silence. There was no declared betrayal, no explicit choice, but still the guilt settles in, heavy and constant. It's a diffuse guilt, appearing in the most common moments, in a laugh that seemed exaggerated, in a thought that lingered longer than it should have, in an involuntary comparison. The personal narrative shows that this guilt doesn't find a clear target, because there is no concrete act to accuse. Yet it grows, and it grows precisely because it cannot be confessed. Without confession, there is no relief. Without relief, guilt spreads to everything, contaminating gestures that were previously neutral. The viewer recognizes that this type of guilt is particularly corrosive. When you don't know exactly what you should ask forgiveness for, the mind creates constant judgments. The person begins to monitor themselves, to punish themselves internally for thoughts, intentions, and feelings that never became actions. The guilt is not resolved because it cannot be explained without revealing what is being hidden. Thus it becomes self-sustaining. The more silence, the more guilt. The more guilt, the more silence. It's a closed cycle where the weight doesn't come from something done, but from the impossibility of being honest about what one feels. And at this point, guilt ceases to be a moral warning and becomes a permanent state, buying emotional space without ever finding a real way to disappear. There is a comfortable belief that sets in too early, the idea that everything is under control, that because there are no explicit declarations, attitudes, or visible decisions, feelings also obey rational rules. The person repeats to themselves that they can stop whenever they want, that all it takes is an internal limit, an adjustment of behavior, a silent decision. The illusion is born precisely from the absence of external chaos. Since nothing has exploded, since everything still seems manageable, false security arises. The analogy is driving without brakes at low speed. The car isn't going fast, the journey seems short, and therefore the risk is underestimated. But the lack of brakes is still there. On any unexpected descent, on any miscalculated curve, the danger reveals itself without warning. The narrative shows that emotional control doesn't work like a switch. Feelings don't obey belated orders. The more time is spent believing that it's possible to manage everything mentally, the more the involvement deepens outside the conscious field. Small gestures gain weight. Absences begin to hurt. Expectations solidify. The observer recognizes the common mistake, confusing silence with control. Not acting is not the same as not feeling. And feeling without admitting it creates a false sense of security. Just as driving slowly without brakes is still driving without brakes, maintaining a contained feeling is still maintaining an active risk. The danger lies not in the immediate intensity, but in the inevitability of losing control when something external happens. Because when the moment comes to actually stop, it turns out that the system never really had brakes, only the comforting impression that they were there. There comes a moment when the artificial equilibrium breaks down, even if nothing visible happens. There is no announcement, no dramatic scene, but the silent realization arises that continuing as things are is no longer possible. Every forbidden love exacts a price, and that price is not optional. Someone has to lose. Sometimes it's not the one who loves nor the one who is loved, but the version of themselves that believed it was possible to sustain everything without consequences. The narrative leads the viewer to understand that sacrifice is rarely declared. It happens behind the scenes, in small decisions, in renunciations that are not explained to anyone. The moment is not marked by a grand gesture, but by an internal choice that alters the course of things forever. The viewer realizes that at this point, the loss is not negotiable, only distributed. Someone loses time, someone loses a possibility, someone loses the illusion of control, someone loses their own peace. Even when no one knows exactly what was sacrificed, something ceases to exist. The tension of the climax arises from this inevitability. It's no longer about avoiding pain, but about deciding where it will be concentrated. Forbidden love demands silence to the limit, and then demands renunciation. There are no neutral endings. The person understands that moving forward implies carrying the mark of a choice that will never be fully acknowledged. And it is at this moment that the conflict reaches its purest form. It's not about winning or losing someone. It's about accepting that every story not fully lived also leaves a trail of loss, even if no one ever knows who paid the price. For a long time, the imagination constructs the scene of the revelation as a definitive event. A long conversation, restrained tears, complete explanations, perhaps even an immediate relief after the truth is told. But when the secret finally comes to light, it almost never happens that way. There is no explosion, no cinematic shock. What exists is a slow, continuous, silent emptying. The balloon analogy explains it precisely. It's not the burst that frightens, it's the constant sound of the air escaping until it loses its shape without anyone noticing the exact moment. The narrative shows that the revelation doesn't happen in a decisive phrase, but in a succession of signs, of partial understandings, of silences that come to mean too much. The viewer recognizes that when this happens, the impact doesn't come from surprise but from the realization. The people involved already felt that something was wrong, they just hadn't put it into words. When the secret becomes visible, and it doesn't solve anything immediately. On the contrary, it removes the support that held everything upright. Relationships don't crumble, they wither. Conversations become shorter, eye contact is avoided, naturalness gradually disappears. The pain isn't acute, it's prolonged. And perhaps the most difficult aspect is understanding that the revelation doesn't bring the expected closure. It doesn't organize the chaos, it only makes it official. Like a balloon that slowly loses air, what hurts most isn't the sudden end but the time it takes to accept that what seemed full of meaning is now empty, without having made any noise when it ended. The silence took its toll gradually, without sending clear bills, without warning when the debt began to grow. At first it seemed like an intelligent choice, almost noble. to be silent to preserve, to be silent to avoid pain, to be silent to keep everything running. But over time, the silence ceased to be a strategy and became a constant burden. Each previous experience fits here like pieces of the same puzzle. The invisible boundary crossed without realizing it, the double life that drained energy. The fear of being discovered mixed with the fear of not being seen, the body crying for help before the mind admitted it. None of this happened in isolation. It was the accumulation that caused the wear and tear. The silence did not erase the feeling. It only pushed it inside, where it grew without ventilation, occupying spaces that were once free. The most mature understanding arises when one realizes that the greatest cost was not a specific event, but the constancy of the containment. Sustaining the silence required permanent emotional vigilance. It required measuring words, controlling reactions, managing expectations that were never promised, living with guilt that had no face, and with the illusion of control that was never real. The viewer understands that this kind of silence is not empty. It is work, an invisible, daily, exhausting job. And the payment was made with parts of one's own identity, the spontaneity that was lost, the lightness that was replaced by calculation, the presence that was never fully present anywhere. Silence taught adaptation, but demanded authenticity. When everything is connected, it becomes clear that silence didn't completely protect anyone. It only postponed confrontations while deepening internal wounds. The real price was carrying alone something that needed space, time, and a voice. This realization doesn't come with revolt. It comes with lucidity. There are no clear villains, only choices understood too late. Silence served a purpose, but it also left marks. Recognizing this cost isn't an attack on the past, it's a sign of maturity. Because only when one understands everything that was paid does it become possible to decide, with more awareness, if this is a price worth paying again. The ending doesn't arrive as a definitive scene, but as a silent understanding that gradually settles in. There is no celebrated union, nor dramatic separation. What happens is an internal transformation, deep and irreversible. The analogy of leaving a house that was never yours accurately translates this moment. For a long time, there was care, presence, adaptation. Schedules, feelings, and expectations were adjusted as if living in a borrowed space, trying not to make noise, trying not to occupy too much. But the moment arrives when one understands that, however familiar the place may have become, it never truly belonged to them. And this realization doesn't come with anger, it comes with clarity. It's not expulsion, it's a conscious departure. The viewer realizes that love, here, doesn't win in the classical sense, but teaches. It teaches limits, it teaches cost, it teaches about what cannot be sustained forever. The transformation happens when the person stops measuring value by how much they endured in silence, and begins to recognize their own right to exist whole. There are no obvious winners or losers, because the greatest change is not external. The bond dissolves without spectacle, because what needed to happen has already happened internally. Learning replaces old hope. Idealization gives way to the mature understanding that not every feeling was made to become a visible story. In leaving this house that was never theirs, something is left behind, but something essential is recovered: their own presence, their own inner voice. The unexpected ending is not the end of love. It is the end of denial. Love fulfilled its function by revealing limits that were previously ignored. And this transforms. Because leaving doesn't mean losing everything. It means, for the first time, not losing yourself. If this story has found a place within you, perhaps it's not by chance. Perhaps because at some point, you too have lived through something you needed to hide. Not from others, but from yourself. It's not an invitation to expose details, nor to explain what cannot be put into words. It's simply a gesture of recognition. If you've been through this, write in the comments a simple word, something that represents this silent understanding. Sometimes admitting it to yourself is the hardest step. And if these stories speak to you, consider subscribing. not as an automatic click, but as a silent pact, an agreement to continue listening to narratives that say, aloud, what many people have learned to keep to themselves for too long. Here, it's not about judgments or ready-made answers, but about identification. Because when someone finds words for what was hidden, something begins to reorganize itself inside. And this continuity only makes sense if you are also willing to recognize yourself in what has not yet been said.